good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody, depending on your locations. On behalf of Cuts International, let me welcome all of you to this webinar on impact of COVID-19 on women traders in Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal. This webinar we are organizing as part of a project which we have been implementing with the support from the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom, earlier known as Department for International Development, under its program Asia Regional Trade and Connectivity Project. So let me begin with by thanking the FCDO colleagues and other colleagues for supporting us in this initiative, not just this webinar, but the overall initiatives from which we have learned a lot, particularly in this COVID-induced world. Unfortunately, I'm unable to say post-pandemic world. I thought I would have said so. Even few weeks back, I thought I would have said so, but that's the unfortunate part. Now, in this project, what we have looked at is the gender dimensions of trade facilitation. And here we challenged one notion. I've been working on this subject for more than 25 years now, towards the end of the GATT regime, beginning of the WTO. And all along we heard that trade facilitation, or rather trade in general, is gender neutral. Theoretically, that may be true. But when we worked on the subject, we went to the ground, we spoke with various stakeholders, women entrepreneurs in particular. We are now absolutely clear that it is not gender neutral. So we have to address this subject in a different manner, with much more positive agenda in mind, positive discrimination, I would say. That's number one. Number two is what we have found when we are working on it, particularly to understand the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, is the women entrepreneurs, women traders who are disproportionately affected as a result of this. And there are various reasons for it. One possible reason is the nature of their business. I'll just give you one example. That tourism sector is hugely impacted. And it is the women who are heavily involved in this sector, not just as employees of hotels or restaurants, but even otherwise. If I look at the backward and forward linkages of this sector, particularly with handicrafts, handloom, and things like that. Then we have, as a result of this pandemic, there is a lot of uncertainty in the beginning because we don't know what to do. So you are dealing with uncertainties, situation with unknown probabilities. Now we are much more informed about its nature, its impact, etc. So now we are dealing with risk, which is about dealing with known probabilities. So this difference between known and unknown probabilities, that is something which we have studied it in our college days, but this pandemic has shown us. And we have found that women traders, women entrepreneurs, they are much more vulnerable to deal with both uncertainties to begin with and now risk. The third and final important thing which I would like to say in my opening remarks is that when we talk about resilience or post-pandemic recovery, if we want to make it more resilient, we have to have a positive agenda, positive discrimination in favor of women entrepreneurship. Otherwise, I don't think that if we, let's say 10 years, 15 years down the line, if we face a similar situation, we may not be able to absorb the shock which we have seen so far over the last 1 year or so. So with that note, before I request our panelists, which is an excellent panel, unfortunately, Mr. Overfield is unable to join us for some reasons. But otherwise, even otherwise, we have an excellent panel. I would propose the sequence as this, that since Kamalaji is going to make a brief presentation and she has to leave also earlier, I would request her to first make her presentation. Then I will come to Mrs. Cyn-Young Park. She's the director of one of the divisions, Regional Cooperation Integration Division of the Asian Development Bank, followed by Mrs. Mandakini Kaul. She's Senior Regional Cooperation Officer for South Asia in the World Bank Group. Then we have three very excellent speakers, entrepreneurs, those who are working on the ground. From Bhutan, we have Mrs. Lhamu. She's the Director General in the Ministry of Labor and Human Resources. From Bangladesh, we have Selima Ahmed. She is a member of Parliament, as well as she's President of Bangladesh Women Chamber. And that's it. Yeah. So Kamalaji is going to speak first. But just before you speak, Kamalaji, as part of this work, we have prepared a document, a research report, where we have looked at the state of women entrepreneurship in this sub-region. We haven't gone so much into the impact of COVID-19 on women entrepreneurs. We're going to come out with a separate report on that. It's more or less ready now. So we are going to first virtually release that report. Let me take this occasion to virtually release it. Then I would request Kamalaji for her presentation. So Swifties, can we virtually do the release of the report? Thank you, Swifties. So Kamalaji, over to you, finally.
Thank you very much, Bipulji, and COUT International for inviting me, one of the speakers. And I'm very pleased to see Mandakini Ji from World Bank, Cyn-Young from ADB, and Anoush, of course, we have met face-to-face a couple of times from WTO. Well, I have a very brief presentation, which I actually prepared based on the given two questions by Bipulji and his colleagues. That's very much focused on the informal sector or informal sector services, focusing on women. Definitely, that's entrepreneurs and trades. And the second point is, how can the civil society, private sector, and public the agencies can do something, whether it's in the policy, whether it's in the practice, how we can respond and recovery measures in the, this, I call still amid COVID-19 instead of impact. So if you don't mind, could you put it my presentation, or shall I put it my presentation?
No, Swifties is, yeah, it's there.
Yeah. So based on that, I framed the title of the presentation is Women in Informal Sector Services. And that's the second line is responses, recovery measures for amid COVID-19. So with that, the next slide, please. I think it's a good, yes, this is the slides. I would like to highlight more from Hindu Kush Himalayas, particularly in the case of mountain context. As Bipulji rightly pointed out that, COVID-19 is not only the public health shock, it's a global economic crisis, which already affecting in the economic crisis. If you see the graphs, my apologies that you can't see much. Ishimod has also done some kind of impact of the COVID-19, looking at the more on the livelihood option perspective. So if you look at the HKH region, the livelihood option, particularly micro, small, medium enterprises, more depends on the agriculture base rather than industry. If you look at the graph, which I refer from our the document published by Ishimod, agriculture-based micro, small, medium enterprises, which are more linked with the informal sector services. Now, if you look at in India, 36 million, this sector employs 60 million people. There is also the workers, laborers that are actually engaged within that sector. Whereas in Nepal, more than 2 million job generates. And as Bipulji rightly pointed out, that is the tourism sector, and that links with the handicraft, maybe even the agribusiness that link with this tourism sector. But what happened? This has been hit hard by the COVID-19, and I would like to emphasize over here not only the women entrepreneur or the trader, but also the workers here who are engaged in these enterprises. Next slide, please. So next slide, please. So that's why the question comes, how can civil society or the private sector fill in the gap, the gender divide, business and trade? I came up with this idea because, now is these, the two sector. One is the woman entrepreneur itself, and where the other one is those who are working in these enterprises. I think we need to give an emphasis, from World Bank and then ADB and also WTO. I think we shouldn't forget those who are working women as well. So I put it in a way that the protection versus promotion. If you look at then the social protection, or we call the social security as well, that's where the civil society has been giving a more emphasis on for instance, the child rights issue, women rights issues. But I coming up some kind of, the things which indicator or the criteria that has been or should focus even in this situation is the insurance package, which is very essential to look after, and definitely the workplace safety. And if they are working in, most of the women who are working in this enterprises sector or even in any company, I'll give you an example in the brick sector, which I'm engaged here at Ishimod, looking at the brick sector, male and female workers. Women are the one who are working in most unskilled labor. I think we need to upgrade that skill as well. I think that's where we need to emphasize. And also the livelihood diversification, as Bipulji rightly pointed out, that if the resilience capacity, which we need to diversify their livelihoods, not only sticking in one sector or activity, particularly, perhaps we need to more, diversify or supplement their livelihood opportunity, which we need to focus. In the meantime, also financial literacy, which need to more focus on how to save money for these workers as well, and definitely the education for their children. That has to be given more emphasis, or they have been given by the civil society INGO. Whereas in the woman entrepreneur, whether in the business or the trader, that has more on the promotion side. Definitely the emphasis has given, for instance, ADB, World Bank, even WTO has given more emphasis during this crisis, the financial soft loan. The government has given that one. Also given the access use of digital technology and platform, which, the last March 11th, most of the women who, raise their, they express that they are actually using the digital platform at the moment, selling their product, which is tremendous actually. Similarly, I think we need to also strengthen the inclusive supply chain and support this women-led business. I think I distinguish these two in very separately, and then private sector has been given more emphasis on the promotion side, and also in the protection side. I think this needs to be very much emphasis when we are dealing in the informal sector business and trader services. Next slide, please. This is my last slide. But how can we raise the voice of these women who are working, the micro, small, medium enterprises, also the workers? I think it has to have, this research. I put it in this, three angle. We have to have a research. That research should be very much evidence-based knowledge generation, which COT International, of course, many institutions has been doing this research during this amid COVID-19. What is the effect of this COVID-19? I think that needs to, need to be happen time to time. In the meantime, there should be a response, which I call the practice, support depending on the situation, which needs to be more action-oriented. And also the policy, we need to continue to work making this invisible women informal sector to make their voices more visible. I think this has to be combination. It wouldn't happen separately. So this is how we can raise the voice of these women who are working informal trade or business services. With this, I would like to end my short presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Kamalaji. Thank you. I think your presentation has set the tone of what we are going to discuss today.
Yeah.
And also this reminds me another project of ours, where we are looking at the conditions necessary for good and better jobs in India. There is a specific, we are looking at in general, also there is a specific gender component to it. And most of the things which you have said, they resonate with what we are finding from the field. In specific sectors, textiles and clothing is one of them, food processing is another one. We're going to look at some services sectors as well. So on that note, let me now come to Dr. Cyn-Young Park. And there are a couple of specific questions for her. One is, what is the impact of COVID-19 on women's labor market participation? Since ADB is doing a lot of work in the Asia Pacific region on this subject, so it would be good to know her views on this, number one. And number two, what can policymakers do to improve the situation of women entrepreneurs in a post-pandemic world? So over to Cyn-Young in about 8 to 10 minutes, please.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chatterjee. Is it possible to control my slide from there? Is it, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So, well, first, response to your question. In fact, I would like to highlight that the COVID pandemic has made a very uneven impact on, between the men and women. And well, it's not necessarily because the coronavirus actually knows the gender of the person and then attack the women separately, but it is because this the pandemic situation perpetuated the existing discrimination and existing, the disadvantage that the women have been facing in the workplace, and then also in household, and then even the social, the situation. That are the reason that why we see the women have been hit even disproportionately more by the COVID-related economic impacts. So can we move to the next slide, please? So the women have faced a large sort of a disadvantage for a really long time, a lot by their employment status, also the sometimes it's the cultural norms and various other sort of social the barriers, and these have resulted the women in lower paying and then low value adding jobs, especially largely concentrated in informal and small scale businesses. Next slide, please. And when the pandemic hit, it seemed that there has been large drop in the women's employment and also labor force participation, and that's why some even call this pandemic induced economic recession as a she-cession. About 40% of women are in industries heavily affected by the pandemic, such as the low skill and labor intensive manufacturing, such as the textile and garments, and a lot of other traditional services, such as the accommodation, food services, or wholesale, retail, trade, and also the real estate business administrative activities. Next slide, please. And you can see that women do find jobs in these actually a lot of labor intensive, low skill in the manufacturing sector in Asia. Or they can be like education, public administration, wholesale, retail, and a lot of traditional services sector. And they are also quite concentrated in health and the social services sector. So next slide, please. Asia Pacific also have large, female workers in an informal sector. This is, the average of the women in the informal sector are about 65%, which is higher than the global average at around 60%. And there's a great variation across economies in the region, but women, especially in South Asia, can or some other region can be very likely in the informal sector. Over like 90% of women are found in the informal sector in Nepal, compared to more in the more high income economies such as Korea, Japan, or Brunei. So next slide, please. While the men are more susceptible to contracting the coronavirus than women, somehow this work environment of a lot of women made them very vulnerable to the disease, because many of them are found in the again the healthcare, personal care, or other even the services industries. And then these services sector tend to require more human-to-human interactions. And because of this, for countries where we can find the data, 65 to 75% of the COVID infections among healthcare workers are women. And these are it's actually not the numbers that are available in Asia, but these are based on the numbers in Western economies. But the situation are likely very different, especially if we count women devoted in personal and then other traditional services sector in Asia. And women are also much less likely employed in the STEM and professional jobs And as we all have seen, in fact, like these like the jobs that allow the workers work from home, or like in a way like it's distant sort of like the place, then they are less likely to contract the disease, and then also they are less likely to lose job. But the women are much less employed in these STEM and also professional jobs that allow for the remote working, and that made them much more also susceptible for the contracting disease and due to the pandemic, losing job. Okay, so next slide, please. This slide actually shows that, as mentioned, that where women work, and as you can see that women in personal care, like health sector, or like health cleaners, helpers, and a lot of these the care industries, the women are highly concentrated, and then it also again followed by many very much labor intensive than the services. So that makes women much more susceptible to disease, and also because of these services were the most hit due to the lockdown and the pandemic situation. They are much more likely to lose job as well. So next slide, please. Even when they are not formally employed, there have been larger challenges outside work. The pandemic has caused the increase in hours spent doing the care and domestic work for women. The closure of school have also increased unpaid care work for women, especially as kids are home, and then they have to manage a lot of essential household work. While fathers not really necessarily taking the equal share of this childcare or household care responsibility. Lockdown have also limited women's access to healthcare, including the family planning services. So 48 million women are estimated to lack access to family planning services, which can result in 7 million unintended pregnancies. And the health routines of women are likely being affected than those of men for both within and outside the cities. Can we move to the next slide? That actually shows the increased outside unpaid care work for women compared to men, and also the women's also the vulnerability of missing out on health routines due to COVID-19. Next slide, please. So what are the other risks that some girls and women are currently also facing? The pandemic has increased the risks that for women and girls, because there are increased reports of domestic violence, either sexual, emotional, or physical, due to a worsened mental health and then increased alcohol and drug use in many developing economies. As distance learning has become a norm during the pandemic, due to the COVID, there's a disruption which might cause a longer-term impact on girls. In some, for example, there's a past sort of experience in Africa due to the Ebola outbreak shows that the girls are more prone to physical and sexual abuse, early marriage, or unplanned pregnancy. And due to economic concerns, some family have been forced to marry off their young daughters or engage them in also the very bad sort of work situation, or the transactional sex. And this it's a little less likely in Asia, as it's not really more pronounced in Asia. Also, some examples in the South Asia, this is a bit less likely because the girl's family need to give dowry during the marriage, and then the pandemic actually makes their household financial situation worse. It's difficult for them to marry off their daughters. But there are many other risks for girls as the girls are girls that stay out of school for extended period, and then which may actually lower the probability for girls to return to school. So this is something that we should be more concerned about. So next slide, please. So what can policymakers do to improve the situation? First is to enhance the social services and the health protection, especially as women are overrepresented in informal sector, have no access to insurance or social services. Moreover, women in the healthcare sector need to receive adequate support, such as the PPE, person protective equipment, or medical care if needed, as well as the extra compensation or extra pay for their care during the pandemic. Secondly, it will be useful to have some conditional, unconditional cash transfers to cash-strapped poor households. ADB responses have been providing some cash transfer food subsidies for the poor in a number of economies, like including India, Kyrgyz Republic, Mongolia, and the Philippines, or providing some technical assistance to identify gender-responsive social protection policies and an investment, especially in Pacific countries. Next would be the provision of targeted support for marginalized girls and boys. As mentioned earlier, the girls face an extra risk of domestic abuse, and also if they are out of school for a long time, they may be unlikely to going back to school. So the government should find more incentive to make it easier for them to go back to school by providing some incentive for parents or the village. And they can also consider the waiving school fees or use low technology interventions, which are likely to be more useful during the pandemic to reach the young kids. So next slide, please. And as we prepare for the post-COVID recovery, the government should create more gender-responsive, education and then training policies. We should try to make sure that the boys and girls have equal access to quality, relevant, and safe educational practices, and the girls should be really encouraged to take up more STEM courses. As we can see that the pandemic is accelerating the digital transformation, we're likely to see much more like technology intensive jobs in the future, and then the girls should be more ready to take up more the technology related basics education when they're young, and then move into also the STEM focused education. There should be also efforts to narrow gender gaps through skill development and job creation. Policymakers should closely monitor women's unemployment and re-employment as the economies reopen. We need to invest more in the education and reskilling of women so that they can really return to the labor force even after the pandemic recovery. And ADB support have been providing the financial and then fiscal and wage support to enterprises and their employees. There's one example that in Samoa, where 4,000 market vendors and 75% of those were women. We have supported the program that these market vendors can operate rent-free for a couple of months in government-owned properties. Policymakers also need to pursue gender-responsive labor market policies and ensure gender equality in pay and representation. The provision of daycare and subsidized child and elderly care will be a good example of these policies to support continued female labor force participation. Other policies can include a flexible working environment, which allow women more hours of the paid work. And finally, we need to address the different forms of gender-based violence. There has been more reported cases that the violence against the women during the pandemic, and the government should step up in providing a strong response and support, such as a helpline and shelters for these women. And the government should also ensure justice and security during these difficult times and raise awareness through information sharing and social campaigns. ADB is currently supporting to this end for Indonesia, Malaysia, and Solomon Islands in their effort to curb violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cyn-Young, particularly for laying out these policy recommendations. So without much ado, I mean, going forward, we need to see how our governments are implementing some of these policies. But the important point which I would like to make here is that it is not just the government, private sector, and civil society. All three have to work together to see to it that there is much more resilience from when we come out of it. There is much more resilience in our economy, and not just the economy, in our society. With that, let me now come to Mandakini Kaul. Mandakini, I have a couple of questions for you. We know that the World Bank is doing a lot of work on trade and also its linkages with women's economic empowerment. So what is the major results of that about the impact of trade on women's economic empowerment? That's the first question. And secondly, we know that there is a strong gender focus about your regional work in South Asia. So if you can tell us more about the gender focus of your regional work on trade and connectivity in South Asia, and what are your plans for the future to take it forward? Over to you, Mandakini, in about 8 to 10 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Bipul. It's a pleasure to be here today with this distinguished panel hosted by CUTS to discuss what is really a very important issue of gender and trade in a pandemic, post-pandemic world. Following on Kamala ji and Cyn-Young, I think my intervention will be very complementary. So today I will focus my remarks around three main areas. The first is the World Bank's global research about women and trade. Second, a little bit about the impact of the pandemic on South Asian women traders and entrepreneurs. And finally, Bipul, as you asked, I'll speak a little bit about our regional interventions, which are focused on women's economic empowerment through trade and connectivity in the eastern sub-region of South Asia. So let me begin by sharing some global knowledge. We have extensive evidence to show that countries that are open to international trade tend to grow faster, innovate, improve productivity, and provide higher incomes and more opportunities to their people. What is less well researched is the link between gender equality and trade, and an understanding of the connections between the women's roles as workers, consumers, decision makers. So the World Bank and the WTO have recently brought out a joint report that marks the first major effort to quantify how women are affected by trade. This has been done through a gender disaggregated labor data set, and I would really urge everyone to have a look at this because this is really unique and seminal in the way that it's bringing together more research out in terms of gender disaggregated data. So let me highlight three important findings about the promise that trade holds for women. First, trade can dramatically improve women's lives by creating new and secure job opportunities, enhancing consumer choice, and increasing women's bargaining power in society. Cyn-Young provided a lot of data about the informal sector. Kamala ji alluded to it. And so we can say that categorically that when you have trade, women's lives will be enhanced by this new and secure job opportunities. Second, countries that are more open to trade also tend to have higher levels of gender equality. What does that mean? Essentially that women's wages tend to be higher, the wage gap between men and women tends to be lower, and they're able to expand women's access to skills and education. And third, the new trends in global trade that we are seeing, a rise in trade and services, global value chains, the digital economy, are opening up important economic opportunities for women. However, and of course, the important rider that for women to reap these rewards, governments have to understand how trade policies tend to affect men and women differently. And this is something on which we are doing more work, and I'll come to it a little bit later. Now, moving on to the pandemic, globally research shows that regardless of an economy's size and level of development, women are disproportionately vulnerable to the disruption caused by COVID-19. This is due to many factors, including overrepresentation in sectors hit hardest by the pandemic, as well as pre-existing gender disparities. I won't go into details, but there are several studies and surveys that describe the impact that has been on women-led enterprises. So for instance, Kriya University did a survey in India, which showed that 1 in 3 women-led enterprises were either temporarily or permanently closed. Another survey conducted in Bangladesh showed that 41% of female entrepreneurs had to close down their business operations altogether after the pandemic. What we have seen is that South Asian governments have actually announced several stimulus packages to provide liquidity support to businesses. However, access to these packages continues to be limited for female entrepreneurs due to several traditional bottlenecks. Various surveys have been conducted across South Asia that highlight the need to support female traders and female entrepreneurs in 3 main areas. The first one, and I don't think this will come as a surprise to anybody, is access to finance. We are already aware of the traditional limitations that female entrepreneurs and traders face due to lack of collateral, due to lack of knowledge and unfamiliarity with procedures, which is only exacerbated by the pandemic. Second, the shift to digital has the potential to be a great equalizer for women to bypass a lot of the traditional trade barriers that they face. But we also see that in the case of South Asia, especially, internet access tends to vary greatly between men and women. And of course, there is the overall issue of digital infrastructure, which is common for men and women, but access, there is definitely a difference. And finally, the World Bank had hosted a webinar about this a couple of months ago, and we are seeing that while some women entrepreneurs are pivoting, adapting, and repurposing their businesses in the short term in response to the pandemic, many report a strong need for training, support, and repeated requests to help with business planning to get through COVID-19 and beyond. So these are 3 areas where we see clear room for both the government, the private sector, the MDBs to all come together and provide support to women entrepreneurs and women traders. Finally, Bipul, you asked me to talk a little bit about our programs in South Asia. So let me turn to the World Bank's work on regional cooperation, integration, and rice. We call it the RICE approach, regional integration, cooperation, and engagement in South Asia. We have recently updated our approach, which is available on our website, and I would encourage you all to have a look at our RICE approach in South Asia. That's what I work on. So today I would like to talk about a unique program, a regional program that we are implementing that supports women's economic empowerment through trade and connectivity, primarily in the Eastern sub-region. This is the program that we implement, which is supported by Australia's Department for Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT. What this program helps to do is two important things. First is to bring new understanding and solutions to overcome what are long-standing trade facilitation and transport barriers. And the second is to actually inform the World Bank's own regional and country investment decisions so that they focus primarily on economic benefits for women, and also to spotlight the negative impacts of connectivity and infrastructure that may well arise from some of these operations. So these are the two areas that we work on specifically through this program. Post-pandemic, this program is also bringing a deeper understanding and tailored solutions to the COVID-19 challenges, which includes, for instance, specifically looking at how we can address trade facilitation barriers in the sub-region for women, the importance of digitization, automated trade, and logistics solution. And finally, just trying to unpack a little bit and understand the impact of falling exports, remittances, and declining tourism on poor women and the vulnerable groups. So what I'll do is let me end by giving you 3 concrete examples of the kinds of activities we are supporting through this program. Both Kamala ji and Cyn-Young mentioned tourism. Bipul, you mentioned it yourself. So an area that we have been working on through this program is actually inclusive tourism. And what we have done is to have demonstration pilots and develop knowledge that can help governments to think and act beyond business as usual and to be reflected in terms of policy and operation. So what do I mean? So for instance, we have tried to look at ways in which destination tourism champions can bring together governments and the private sector in some areas. And we have conducted a couple of pilots in India's Northeast, particularly to see how we can address the challenges which are being faced by the MSMEs, the micro, small and medium enterprises, especially women-led enterprises in the tourism sector. And the areas that we have focused on are building awareness and imparting training on digital marketing and access to finance, which, as we know, is essential to sustain small businesses during COVID. Another area that we have been working on is the challenges for women-owned SMEs due to poor logistics, transportation services, and to see what are the changes that are needed to be made in infrastructure and regulatory environment. So for this, we conducted a survey where all 4 of the BBIN countries extended full cooperation in collection of the survey data in special economic zones along the Eastern Corridor. And we are now seeing if we can work with one of the governments, one of the departments for promotion of industry and trade, to see how this information can be disseminated to support logistics solutions, which, as we know, is essential for smooth inter-regional trade and can also bring direct benefits to women. A third area that we've been working on is to see how we can engage and develop broader networks to build knowledge and facilitate change to address gender gaps. So an important area that we've been supporting is the South Asia Women in Power Sector Professional Network, which is called the We Power Network, where we are actually working closely also with the ADB to see how we can address gender gaps in the growing energy sector area. And this comes back to the point of how do we bring more women into STEM? How do we bring in the private sector? How do we bring everyone along? So the We Power Network is an important area that we are working with and supporting. Finally, a little bit about another program that we have worked on in the past. Bipul, you know about this. This is something that we have done with support from the FCDO, erstwhile DFID, which is to examine a little bit about the cross-border value chains between the Northeast India and BBN countries to understand how women and the bottom 40% of the workforce could benefit from participating in these regional value chains. And we have looked specifically at spices, fruit and vegetables, bamboo, medical tourism to see how some of this, in a sense, the work that's often done in terms of analytic work can be operationalized. So these are some of the things we've done prior to the pandemic, some that we are doing in response to the pandemic. I'm conscious of the time. Bipul, you asked for 8 to 10 minutes. So let me end by saying that trade can expand women's role in the economy and decrease disparities by giving women more and better employment opportunities. seizing these employment opportunities will be even more important in a pandemic and post-pandemic world. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mandakini. You were more or less on time. So I have a question for you, which I'll come back to you later. I mean, given the fact that I'm sure you must be aware that India has come out with this new National Trade Facilitation Action Plan for the next 4 years. And for the first time, there are specific provisions for facilitating women traders to do more and more cross-border trade. And this report which you have released today, this is also going to be very useful for your own work on trade facilitation in East and South Asia, particularly the gender aspect, gender dimensions of trade facilitation. So on that note, let me now come to Mrs. Ahmed. You have heard these speakers so far, and one thing which is particularly striking is that while governments have announced a number of stimulus packages, but they are, in some cases, we have found that they are not working on the ground, and there are various reasons for that. So my question to you would be that, knowing that there is no point in repeating what we know, but what next? How we can do things differently so that they can work on the ground? Let's not look into this formal informal dichotomy all the time, but what needs to be done so that government stimulus packages can be more effective for our small and medium, micro, small entrepreneurs, particularly those which are led by women. So over to Mrs. Ahmed in about 8 to 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Bipulda, and thank to Katz for always bringing me in this very important event, which is very close to my heart. When you are almost the last speaker, it's always good that you don't have to say much, but the challenge is that I don't repeat, and I'll try to do that. As all of us know, the crisis, what has happened with the women entrepreneurs. But Bangladesh, and I'm sure the other countries, has also declared a stimulus package. So let me just speak on for Bangladesh. The interesting thing is that, you know, about 200 billion taka was announced by the government to give stimulus package. And 5% was supposed to be distributed to the women entrepreneurs. So Bangladesh Women Chamber of Commerce and Industry, we have around 7,000 women entrepreneurs who are direct members, but we work with more than 50 to 60,000 women entrepreneurs. And when we are doing a research, and we found almost 80 or 70 to 80% didn't receive anything from the stimulus package. Some did. But interestingly, in a newspaper I found, and also from the central bank, that 5.7% has been dispersed, which is more than 5% allocation for the women entrepreneurs has been dispersed from the stimulus package for the women entrepreneurs. Now the question is, then who are they? Who are these women entrepreneurs? So these are the big companies where women entrepreneurs are also holding a major shareholder, and they are taking that money. So the SMEs are in big crisis because that quota has been finished, because that 5% has been done. So bankers are showing that, government has given a stimulus package and we are doing so. So currently MSME in women in business are in very bad condition. And when we are thinking of planning again for the Ramadan and the Paila Baishak is coming on the first Roja, first Ramadan. So again, we are missing that opportunity. And again, a second wave has come. So whatever we were supposed to come back, that comeback has been again stopped out. So what we have now, the solution, the solution is that what we are thinking is about the credit guarantee scheme, because many bankers are not comfortable of giving it to a very small entrepreneur or a micro entrepreneur who doesn't have that assets or anything in their name. One of the things also we have found that the exporters, when you are talking about the traders or the cross-border trade, there are many women entrepreneurs who used to rely on trade fairs. They used to go to the Nepal trade fair, they used to go to the Pragati International Trade Fairs or the Sri Lanka Trade Fair and used to sell their product. They could not participate. So this whole year that participation has gone. So these small exporters who are actually traders, they have lost that business. Another agri producer also has lost business because especially on the COVID situation last year, the mango producers, the lychee producer or the agro processors entrepreneurs, they couldn't do anything. Because one, they didn't get the product because that time Bangladesh was in shutdown. So whole thing was still in a crisis. And when we talk about the border heart, I think for the small entrepreneur, this is a really strong avenue. But even now, things are now almost to shut down. So we have to see that we need to give an enabling environment, but with a small cash now. Either it can be a stimulus package, either it can be donation, either can be whatever the form, the name can be, but a sum of money is very important for the women entrepreneurs, and not only for Bangladesh, but for this region to restart their business. And also the good thing is that women entrepreneurs was shy in using technology, but from this COVID situation, they have learned about it. So new avenue also has started. So now we need to build their capacity so that they can use this technology, come into the digital market. So new technology has, new arena has come, capacity building, giving infusion of money, and technology, use of technology. If we can build the capacity, things will be better. That's we should be positive. We cannot be negative. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mrs. Ahmed, to end on a positive note. Of course, there are opportunities. There are challenges. There are opportunities as well. I'll come to Mrs. Lhamu on this particular point. Glad that you have flagged that this age-old issue of whoever has more power, it's also a question of power equation, actually. They can grab much more easily. And the second important point which you highlighted is about the importance of local markets. Our neighborhood market, neighborhood stores. And in fact, it was they who saved our lives at least during the initial period of the lockdown. Everything was closed. It was our neighborhood kirana stores, the grocery stores who helped us to sustain our lives also. So with that, on that note, let me come to Mrs. Lhamu. You have heard all these previous speakers. You heard that while there are challenges, there are opportunities. And it is also very clear, evident now that those who can adjust quickly, those entrepreneurs, those who can adjust quickly, they are in a much better position to sustain their business, even during this challenging time, and also expand. So I would request your thoughts on this, that how we can see to it that women entrepreneurs are much more resilient, so as to say, to learn much more quickly. What would be the role of digital entrepreneurship development and things like that, particularly from a society like Bhutan, where there is, if I may say so, there is, relatively speaking, much more gender equality as compared to some other societies. I'm not going into the merits or demerits of them, but I'm stating some fact. So over to you, Mrs. Lhamu, in about 8 to 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Bipul. And just to start off, as we all know, the pandemic has heightened inequalities and also reversed strides that were made in the area of gender equality. And the year of the pandemic, 2020, it marked the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action and all countries were ready to report their progress to the Committee on the Status of Women. But ironically, the COVID also happened in 2020, and we were very sad to see that many and much of the progress that has been made, it suffered a setback, and mostly in the economic empowerment of women and gender-based violence. So findings from the World Bank and United Nations have also shown that the impact from the pandemic, it weighs heavier on women, mostly in terms of the rising domestic violence reports that we have all heard on the media and also seen at home, and also due to lower earnings. It really impacted the earnings from women. And mainly because women also had to take on the increased care responsibilities at home, as many of them were in the informal sector. All across the world, women were also left out of COVID-19 response and recovery plans because women's absence in decision-making and policy-making roles, it actually impacted that. That is why women were also left out of COVID-19 response and recovery plans. And in around 30 countries, what was found was that women accounted for only a quarter of the decision makers on COVID-19 response panels, handling the health emergency and the economic consequences. The global survey that was done also found that 7 in 10 pandemic frontliners are female, yet although they were there in the front lines, they were largely left out of the decision making in the response and recovery plans. So against that, according to the UN, in the wake of the pandemic, an additional 47 million women would have fallen into extreme poverty in 2021 due to the fact that they are overrepresented in sectors that have been badly hit, such as retail, hospitality, care, and domestic work. So coming back to Bhutan, it is also true that women entrepreneurs in Bhutan have been very badly affected, and the sectors that they are engaged in have been the hardest hit, and many have had to look for alternative means of livelihood, sometimes not so successfully, as their resilience was not so strong. And many of them had to discontinue existing lines of work or professions, especially in the running of micro enterprises, import and export businesses, cross-border trade, beauty and care, hospitality, and the service industries. Because as I also said in another webinar, the tourism sector was also very badly hit. And women were there in the hospitality and service, a higher proportion were women in these industries. Also, turning back to gender-based violence, a violence against women and girls study in Bhutan, which we conducted before the pandemic, found that about 45% of women experienced one or more forms of violence in their lifetime. There was also recorded a high tolerance towards violence, around 53% of women saying that violence was acceptable in certain circumstances. So during the pandemic, Bhutan also recorded a spike in gender-based violence, given the high prevalence rate that was already there pre-pandemic. As per the study carried out, GBV is also highly underreported. So one can conclude that many cases also went underreported, especially in the circumstances of lockdown and restricted movements and limited access to protection services and service providers in Bhutan. Frequent lockdowns, school closures, and increased health risks also led to increased care responsibilities at home, which disproportionately affected women, and many had to give up their sources of income. And because many of them were also in the informal sector, and most of their jobs could not be carried out remotely. So this actually exacerbated social, emotional, economic tensions within households, which led to that increase in domestic violence and poverty, especially for households that were already vulnerable. So in December 2020, a webinar was conducted of 19 Bhutanese women entrepreneurs by the Bhutan Media and Communication Institute, which already works with CUTS International. And Ms. Veena from CUTS International also attended that webinar. And this was just before the second lockdown in Bhutan. The participants highlighted how the pandemic had increased their unpaid care work burdens at home and at the same time affected their micro and small businesses such as local fashion houses, which depended on tourists, flower nurseries, sanitary pads because of raw material constraints, hair and beauty parlors, just to cite a few examples. And also how they had to look for alternatives such as producing face masks during the COVID period. But there was not a lot of alternatives also that were available to them. They shared that although many credit schemes existed, women found it difficult to access financial support. They also lacked ICT skills, which made advertising and selling their products online during the COVID impossible. The women entrepreneurs during the webinar also felt that they missed the opportunity to use digitalization and technologies to overcome their challenges presented by the COVID. They were of the view that if they received support to build capacities and skills in ICT, entrepreneurship, and other areas, access to relief and affordable finance and credit, and adequate childcare and other support mechanisms, they would have been able to, and they would be able to rebuild and start again in a better way. So what I feel is that support measures need to target informal, part-time and seasonal workers, most of whom are women. They must include direct support to informal workers such as financial support and access to credit, targeting women entrepreneurs in micro and small businesses, targeting skilling towards women's interests and needs, like cited above, like in ICT and digitalization, ensuring entrepreneurship development trainings and end-to-end support in terms of facilitation of product development, packaging, marketing, access to credit, among other things. Along with targeted measures, COVID recovery must include bringing on board the trade and industry sectors, the Chamber of Commerce and Industries, and also the application of a gender lens in policies and programs. So presently, the trade and industry sectors, they lack that gender lens in their policies and programs and interventions that are adopted. Then strengthening CSOs working with women entrepreneurs is also something that needs to be stepped up, and ensuring a conducive environment for women to participate, taking into consideration their needs and interests, and also targeting the sectors that women are most represented in, mostly the informal, the lower skilled and lower paid sectors, and where protection and safety nets also do not exist. In Bhutan, while the women's organizations with developing partners had drafted and implemented a stand-alone contingency plan on gender-based violence during the COVID-19, it is realized that women's voices were largely left out of national level comprehensive socio-economic recovery and responsive plans. As such, it is my hope that it is not too late to conduct a gender analysis and ensure that long-standing gender inequalities are addressed in the recovery plans, and that a gender assessment on the impact of COVID-19 on women and girls would be conducted, and this would help to provide a strong basis for effective actions and interventions from a gender perspective. Thank you. That is
Thank
all.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Lhamu. One thing which is very clear, what you just told us with anecdotal evidence, with stories, they resonate so well with what Dr. Cyn-Young told us or showed us with data. My point is the issues, many of them are universal in nature. Of course, there are local contexts, local nuances. That brings me to the importance of knowledge share. What is working well where? And how can I get that knowledge into my own local context to see to it that whether it can work with us well or not. On that note, let me come to the last, but certainly not the least, speaker of today's session. This session is being organized actually as part of the Aid for Trade stock-taking event of the development division of the World Trade Organization. And we have with us Anoush Boghossian, who is the head of trade and gender unit in the development division of the WTO. She has been working rigorously on gender dimensions of trade facilitation. So Anoush, after hearing all this, what are your thoughts on how we can make women traders more comfortable in doing cross-border trade, particularly through land ports? So let's hear your thoughts in about 10 minutes.
So thank you very much, people, for inviting me in this great panel. There are some things that I will not repeat because this is made. The distinguished speakers before me have painted the picture pretty clearly. Maybe I would like to focus more on the issue of women entrepreneurs and how they were a bit more affected by the COVID crisis, and focusing on specific issues. And women entrepreneurs have been hit hard because they are small. And if we look at the BBIN region, about 42% of women-owned businesses employ less than 10 employees, and 22% between 11 and 30 employees. So this is, the vast majority of women-owned businesses are very small. And we've seen numerous studies from across regions highlighting and demonstrating that small businesses have been hit the hardest. So, and it has been said also by other speakers. What I would like to focus on is also other reasons why women entrepreneurs have been hit the hardest is not because they're working in sectors that were mostly affected by the crisis, as has been highlighted earlier. I would like to focus on one sector because the other sectors other speakers have focused on, which is the agriculture and food production sector. You mentioned these food markets. Actually, if we look around the world across regions, we've seen that many informal food markets where female farmers as well entrepreneurs were selling their products have been closed. And often we've seen that in the past, these markets were very much undervalued. And now, as you said, these markets have saved lives, basically. And for example, if we're looking at some of the figures, in most developing countries, about 80% of livestock product is sold in those informal food markets. They are located where consumers do not have access to supermarkets, for example. And in the livestock product sector, about 2/3 of the world's 600 million poor livestock keepers are women. So we see that women play an essential role in food and especially protein providers, especially for poor consumers. So this is a very important aspect of this issue. And so basically creating dedicated and specially designed structures adapted to the pandemic could be an answer to keep these markets open. I think also women in agriculture working with obviously perishable goods, and they have lack of storage capacity. If we look at the BBIN region, 32% of women entrepreneurs work in agriculture. So this is quite an important sector for these women entrepreneurs. And again, talking about informal cross-border traders, they also face difficulties due to the pandemic related to sanitary norms, but I will expand on this a bit later. I also wanted to focus on the tourism sector. It was mentioned before, but I also wanted to show that it's not just those women who have, let's say, tourism businesses. It's also all the businesses that are linked to the tourism sector. I mean, we've talked about hospitality. We've talked about a lot of other things. I'll just give you an example of this woman entrepreneur in Nepal. She has this company, this Sherpa company. She's been closed since the pandemic outbreak, and she was also employing other women indirectly in the mountains, because these women were feeding the tourists in those refuges that are located in the mountain. So these women were providing tea and food for the tourists and the mountain climbers, and actually these women have lost that sort of income. So there is direct consequences of losing your businesses or closing your business. There are also direct consequences, indirect consequences for other women that are employed through these sectors. Another sector which also I want to mention, which was not mentioned, is the domestic services. If you look at the global figure, about 80% of the 67 million domestic workers are women, and it's not just a question this sector is also a tradable sector. Some countries have started to open up their services market to foreign domestic workers to foster their women participation in the economy. So this is something which also has had a huge impact on women entrepreneurs. Just a look at some figures in the entrepreneurs in the BBIN region. 70% are working in manufacturing, and the vast majority are in handicraft. So looking at the retail, we see that it has been, it has been very difficult for those women entrepreneurs working in this sector. I think, we've mentioned a lot about access to finance. I'm not going to go to develop on that further, except to say that so basically women entrepreneurs have used their savings earned to be able to pay the rent, salaries. In some cases they had to pay security guards. We see, for example, in Afghanistan, they had 50% of the businesses of businesswomen had to keep at least one paid security guard to maintain workplace safety and to keep the stores out of danger. So this is also something like, these kind of expenses we don't think about, but this is quite important. And if we look at where women entrepreneurs reinvest their income, overall in South Asia, 67% of women entrepreneurs reinvest in their business. And in the BBIN region, it's 70% of them. So, this means that the lack of income has a direct impact on business development, obviously. They've lost a lot of sales opportunities. So the pandemic was really bad timing. Women entrepreneurs have told me that when the pandemic arrived, it was already the end of the winter, which is already a bad season for business. Also, as was mentioned by a previous speaker, in some countries, the end of winter is festive season, so there was loss of business opportunity there. And it's the same thing in other regions. If we look at Latin America, for example, we see that 75% of women entrepreneurs were facing issues related to managing workers, their health, safety, and payments, and 75% were also facing issues for paying loans, interests, and clients. So this financial aspect is very important. And unfortunately, they don't have access to the different financial packages that were set up by governments. I mean, if you look at UNDP's policy tracker, you will see that only 7% of recovery packages include economic security measures targeting women. Only 7% globally. It's really nothing. And actually, I'm not saying that governments are excluding women on purpose. They're not excluding them on purpose. They are de facto excluded because of the very harsh conditions that are imposed on having access to these different loan schemes. For example, in one government, the condition was to have access to the loan on the basis of 50-50 co-sharing. but we know that women entrepreneurs have lost their income. So how, and they've spent the money, that they had to cover for their expenses. So they don't have the opportunity to co-share this kind of loans. In other countries, you have the different schemes that are set up by governments, especially in one country in the agriculture sector. This is something where women work a lot, as we know, as we've seen. So they had to, but they didn't have any specific conditions for them. So they had to compete with men. And often they said that they were sidelined in these situations. Other examples, in a developed country this time, we see that, for example, the packages are targeting companies where they have employees. And the vast majority of women entrepreneurs in that country are actually self-employed. So they don't have employees, so they can't have access to these stimulus packages. So basically, the lack of access to finance is a key one. We've seen that. And there are spillover effects from this. They are, as I said, they lose their jobs, not their jobs, they're also their employees and the ones who are indirectly employed. Also, it means that, I've said that they're reinvesting their income into their companies, but also they're also investing their income into their family. And if we're looking at the pandemic issue, they are the ones who are making, who are spending the most on health issues in the family. So we can see that 80% of the family's healthcare spendings is done by women, and they spend 29% more on healthcare than men. So also that has an impact. The pandemic has an impact, a direct impact on the health issue, in the sense that women don't have the income to invest more in their family, and it goes beyond the health issue. If we look at how they reinvest their income, we see that it's the second pillar of investment is the family house expenses after their businesses. So in the BBIN region, 53% of women entrepreneurs reinvest their income into the family house expenses. So I think these kind of spillover effect, we have to really understand them and to really look at them. In terms of trade, I think, we see that this crisis has really crushed their abilities, their readiness, and their willingness to export. So they're really stepping backward. Obviously, the trade, the finance, as mentioned, issue is an important one. The trade finance issue is a very important one. Already, it was identified by women entrepreneurs as being one of the most important obstacles to have access to markets is access to trade finance. But also they can't even afford simple trade or export costs, such as investing in an IT system or skilled staff to deal with customs issues, packaging and standards. So obviously that possibility has gone. They cannot afford them anymore. And of course, these obstacles hinder women to attract the investors who are more inclined to go to more solid businesses, let's say. As I mentioned earlier, I wanted to talk about also the difficulties of cross-border trading, especially in the agriculture sector. I mean, these cross-border traders, most of them are informal, but they play a central role in food security, and actually they are really key players in these in a domestic, local, but also at the regional and international level. So these female cross-border food traders, they face difficulties because of travel, trade restrictions imposed by the pandemic. The vast majority of these cross-borders are obviously in developing countries. And if we look at pictures, examples from South Africa, from the South African region, we see that they contribute up to 20 million annually in the value of trade in the region. So it's really the contribution not only to food security, but also to trade in the region is enormous. And so they provide food to places where the supply is lacking, fresh food. For example, if we look at, I'm taking examples in West Africa because in Africa, because I don't have examples in South Asia, unfortunately. But I think it's quite relevant still that in West Africa, for example, we have a food deficit in the region, and these traders are in essential food, let's say, they account for about 30% of total trade in the region. So this pandemic has slowed down trade facilitation. We've seen at the borders a lot of traffic, which is stopped, borders, drivers being tested, trucks being fumigated. Also, there is a lot of mistrust on both sides of the border. Drivers have to be tested again, and women entrepreneurs are, caught in these confusion. And another thing which I wanted to highlight is that at the border there is a lack of adequate infrastructure. This lack of infrastructure was already a big issue for women cross-border traders, but with the pandemic, it's even more of an issue. For example, if you look at toilets at the border for women, sometimes they don't have even soap. So how can you wash your hands, or how can you keep yourself healthy if you don't even have access to this basic sort of infrastructure at the border? So I think that that lack of infrastructure has prevented from women being safe from the virus. Again, somebody has mentioned that there was rare opportunities to go international. Those women who were relying on international trade exhibitions or trade fairs, they could not do this anymore. Also, the fact that they were suitcase exporters. They can, this kind of trade cannot take place anymore. And I think more importantly, I want to emphasize the fact that they've lost their ambition to go international. I've talked to about more than 30 entrepreneurs across the South Asia region, and most of them have all said, we cannot do this. This is not my priority. They've lost that ambition. They said, I'm going to focus on the domestic market. They are often limiting their activities, so they can go international even less. And I think this is something that there is also that we need to take into consideration, how we can give them this ambition back. I mean, sometimes I've read this expression. We talk about startup depression. That is to say that new companies don't even enter the job market or the international market because of the pandemic. So that's also something which I think it needs to be looked at. Just a few more things. Looking at opportunities. I think
briefly, Anoush.
Yes, very, very briefly. I think there are some opportunities in some booming sectors where women already dominate. I'm thinking about the wellness industry. This is something that is quite important. Everybody has talked about digitalization, and what we can learn from Latin America, for example, is that women entrepreneurs have received support and training on these issues. 70% of them have received training on digital transformation, such as on e-commerce, but also training on innovation and creativity. 40% of women entrepreneurs in Latin America have been supported through that. But I just want to have a little bit of a caution about, is going digital the solution? I know we have all these new technologies, and it's not just about e-commerce. It's also about how consumers are changing the way they consume, actually, and actually more and more purchases will be done online or are done online already. There are new technologies such as augmented realities or that are conquering the retail industry. For example, we see in South Korea that more and more consumer experience shopping online, but not just buying online. It's just they're using augmented reality to try the products, including cosmetics, and it gives them also a certain sense of security, protection against the virus. So doing this kind of shopping experience, obviously, they appeal to virtual assistants to help them in their choices. So the real, the women who are working in those shops, the physical assistants, they are no longer needed. Also, automation has been accelerated due to the COVID pandemic. So I think this is also some issues that needs to be integrated in when governments also design policies. Again, on consumers' patterns that are changing, there are also more consumers are looking also at authenticity, where the products are coming from. They also want to know, there are opportunities, consuming opportunities that are created in the circular economy, for example, but also business opportunities. So these are things that will probably have a big impact on women entrepreneurs. And as somebody said, they need to be ready for these changes. But we see that women entrepreneurs are adapting their business to these new trends. We can see that in the tourism sector in Nepal, for example. And another point is, and a final point, is the role of standards in mitigating gender-specific impacts of COVID-19. That also can be, integrated in the various solutions that are put into place. Obviously, standards in trade facilitation, also in worker protections. Now we have new types of workers working from home. So, this is something that maybe will need to be looked at. And also, there is this issue now of defining women entrepreneurs and designing an international standard of what is a woman entrepreneur. There is currently work led by the Swedish Department of Standardization and the International Trade Center, and they have come up with a proposal to have a standard defining women entrepreneurs, and this could be also very helpful, especially in government procurement, in accessing government procurement markets. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anoush. I mean, overall, I think that today's webinar is so rich in content. So I have no intention to summarize it. We have already overshot our time. Anyway, the long and short of the story is that there are severe impact of COVID-19 on our economy, and not just on our economy, on our society. And women entrepreneurs are perhaps disproportionately impacted as a result of this. But at the same time, there are opportunities. So, and opportunities are there in various spheres, various spaces. So we need to see what kind of a good enabling environment that we can think of to encourage our entrepreneurs, particularly women entrepreneurs, to avail those opportunities so that this post-pandemic recovery is much more resilient. So on that note, I think it would be good to hear your final thoughts, at least for the time being, on this subject. So what I would do, I would give 1 minute each to each of you, and for your final thoughts on what next about the positive agenda on this subject. So if I may first request Dr. Cyn-Young Park in one minute.
Well, thank you very much. It was a very rich discussion during this webinar. Well, if I given just 1 minute to speak about any chances that we can actually make progress rather than regress on women's the equal rights in all types of the economic engagement. I would really like to emphasize that we need to think of like what the future work really will be like, and then how we ensure that the women do get equal opportunity in participating in the labor market. And it's maybe it is not too late, and we need to really give fair chances for girls, and provide girls to pursue also the the technology and then STEM education. I think these are very important to equip girls with the necessary skills for the future, and then that's what I would really like to see for post-pandemic lessons for education policies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think access to opportunity is the key. And in order to do all this, it's not just we should look at it from the lenses of women's empowerment, but main folks of the society, they have to be also sensitized. This is something which we have learned over 30 years of grassroots work in rural Rajasthan in particular. On that note, Mandakini, your final thoughts?
Thank you, Bipul. So if I may, maybe I can have make two specific suggestions. One is that because I work on issues of regional cooperation and integration in South Asia, I would say that there are some concrete measures that the BBIN countries, for instance, the Eastern Bloc countries could take in terms of improving intra-regional trade. And so, we can look at issues of non-tariff barriers, stronger focus on development of regional economic corridors, enhancing skills and capacity in public and private sector for a broad range of stakeholders. So that I think is generally to improve the environment for intra-regional trade and then beyond. The other specific suggestion I would say, since we've spent a lot of time today talking about women traders, women entrepreneurs, is the role of different national, regional, and indeed multilateral institutions to facilitate women-run businesses to survive and expand their operations at this time. And so I think in this respect, I think all of us, and you mentioned what CUTS is doing in Rajasthan, the World Bank's doing it at a regional level and at a country level. I know the ADB and other organizations are doing this, is to really come together to appreciate the underlying challenges that small women-led entrepreneurs face, and to then help them, I mentioned some things like training, access to finance. So for all of us to come together and find ways in supporting these enterprises, I think that's what I would say as specific next steps. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Mandakini. Again, I would reiterate this point, access to opportunities for skill development. I'll give you one example. A friend of mine, she is into sari business, and about a month after the initiation of the lockdown, she called me saying that she's facing a lot of problems. Her business is stopped, not just for business, but she is getting innuendos, remarks, societal issues. So I told her to just do one thing: start taking some lessons in doing digital, your business digital. And today she is doing very well. And she has fully recovered from the losses which she suffered for several months. So access to opportunities, skill development, these are the key things. Mrs. Ahmed, your final thought?
Thank you very much. I think we need to talk more about getting equal property rights. If we have property, many things we can do. Violence for women should be stopped, because that social barriers is a big hindrance for women's economic empowerment. And finally, which you said, Bipul, bringing women into digital arena, and for that capacity building is very important.
Thank you. And very important that about property rights. That should be a positive agenda. Discrimination, I would use the word. Of late in our country, we are giving land pattas, land rights to the women of the household, of a household. So these kind of positive things which we need to do on the ground. And this is not going to happen overnight. You see, it has to be, there has to be a process, and we have to be patient and passionate, at the same time objective, taking into account various balancing factors in order to take this agenda forward.
We need to talk about it more. We need to have
Yeah.
dialogue on it. Thank you.
Mrs. Lhamu, your thoughts?
Thank you, Mr. Bipul. I would like to leave 2 action points on the table. One is the need to really do some proper assessments on the COVID-19 impacts of women, especially in the trade and industry sector, women entrepreneurs. And because if we are to take targeted action, we have to have that information, that specific information. And the other thought, the other action that comes to my mind in this area. So I'm hoping that I will be able to target some actions towards skilling women in the areas that they need to be skilled in. Thank you, Mr. Bipul.
Thank you. So targeted action, that's very important. So finally, Anoush, again, your final thought. We know that, just to tell the audience, cross-border informal trade is a very important factor for food security at the local level in particular, at the household level, in border areas in particular. And this is what we have found in South Asia, Eastern South Asia in particular. And this is more or less same in various parts, various regions of the world, particularly the developing world. Anoush, trade facilitation, what are your final thoughts?
I think my final thoughts will be a bit more general. I think, often when governments have, designed policies or set up programs, they do it and then they include gender afterwards, realizing, oh, there is this, we should do something about this. Actually, I think they should embed gender from the start. And it's not such an easy thing to do because when you don't have the data, when you don't know where women are in your economy, whether they are entrepreneurs, small businesses, or part of a bigger company, or they are just workers, in which sectors, if you don't have that data, you will not be able to have policies or programs that target the needs of women in the adequate way. So I think this is something which, maybe a call to governments and also other stakeholders, not just governments, to really gather that data, to understand that knowledge. And maybe another point, looking at women entrepreneurs, I think they need to be given a voice. They are not listened enough. They are not, women associations, women entrepreneurs associations at the national level, at the regional level. They do so much amazing work, and they don't have a voice. They don't have a seat at the table. And I think they should definitely.
Thank you, Anoush. This reminds me one thing, that if, let's say, 10 years ago we were organizing this program, then by now we would have received a call from somewhere in Delhi, and why are you talking about trade and gender linkages? This is another form of non-tariff barriers, sanctions, etc., etc. And today we are discussing it in a much more positive manner, with a positive mindset, forward-looking agenda. So this is the good change which has happened over the years. And this is a gradual process. And as we make progress economically, societal manner, these positive changes are bound to happen. It's not that positive things are not happening. Several positive things are happening. Sometimes we are not even noticing them. So data, and there are stories behind data, positive stories. And that's something which you need to take into account more and more, and do awareness generation, dissemination, capacity building to take forward this agenda. So on that positive note, let me now request our mentor, Mr. Pradeep Mehta, for any final remarks on a subject on which he has been thinking more than 35-30 years, and he has very good grassroots experience on a subject like this. So what do you say?
Thank you very much. Thank you for those very complimentary remarks, Bipul. Well, I mean, generally, I would like to think about issues which affect our society, and particularly the kind of discrimination which happens against the female sex in the society. So there are a lot of root problems which impact trade, which impact the economy as well. When you said access of opportunities, it comes out from that root problem of the kind of disadvantage that a woman faces, and the hesitancy which she has in trying to break the barriers, or as they say, to break the glass ceiling. Now that requires a lot of effort, and therefore conversations like this are very important, very, very critical in order to raise the flag as well as raise the crescendo, which is so important. This has been recognized by the Sustainable Development Goals as well, and these are issues which we must be able to continue to have conversations, including thinking about affirmative action programs on specific issues. Like one example which came up was property rights. Things are happening, changing in India, and they will continue to change in other parts of the world as well. If a glossary of this kind of a document on the kind of affirmative action programs which are taking place are documented and shared widely, that this is how you can advance and particularly attack the root problems of the discrimination, then things would be much more better. With that, let me also thank you all once again for a very rich discussion, and I'm sure we'll be having more of these conversations in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and let me join Pradeep and other colleagues in once again thanking you. Very positive. We are ending on a very positive note, and we will continue to pursue this agenda. Now, one positive impact among various other positive impact that we talked about is COVID-19 is that both Pradeep and me are bearded, and that's a positive. And so we are using less water and contributing towards the betterment of the environment. So on that positive note, let me thank you once again and say bye for the time being. Thank you.